10 minutes. That was all the time it took for an empire to fall, because of one hand raised in anger. When Helen Cox stepped between a screaming socialite and a confused, elderly woman, she thought she was losing her livelihood. She had no idea that the frail woman in the light blue lace was the only living heart in the chest of Kang Tae-jin, the dragon of Seoul, and the most feared shadow on the continent. Helen didn't just take a slap that night. She triggered a massacre of reputations. The revenge that followed wasn't just swift. It was absolute. The chandeliers of the Choi mansion didn't just provide light. They radiated arrogance. The warm golden glow spilled across polished marble and classical oil paintings, casting long, dramatic shadows over the hundreds of guests who wore their wealth like armor. For Helen Cox, the light was a curse. It highlighted the sweat on her brow and the red raw ache in her feet, cramped into the sensible flats her agency demanded. Helen adjusted her beige apron, her fingers steady despite the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. She had to stay upright. Her sister's medical school tuition was due in 3 days, and in the predatory world of the Choi family, one slip-up meant the end of a paycheck. To the elite sipping vintage Krug in this hallway, Helen wasn't a person. She was a dark brown uniform, moving furniture that was invisible until it was in the way. Tonight was the gala of the decade, a celebration of the Choi shipping merger. Near the grand hallway, the daughter of the house, a woman in a sleeveless ivory gown, was holding court. She was beautiful in the way a jagged piece of glass is beautiful, sharp, cold, and dangerous. Helen moved through the crowd, collecting empty flutes, when she saw her. Near the buffet stood an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a soft, traditional updo. She wore a light blue lace dress that was elegant but lacked the aggressive flash of the socialites around her. She looked lost, her eyes wide with a growing alarm, clutching a small purse as if it were a life raft. A waiter brushed past the old woman, nearly knocking her over. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look back. The old woman flinched, her mouth opening in a silent plea for help that no one in the room was prepared to hear. Helen felt a familiar tug in her chest. She knew what it felt like to be a ghost in a room full of monsters. Suddenly, the ivory-clad socialite turned sharply, complaining loudly about the temperature of the hors d'oeuvres. She wasn't looking. The collision was violent. A glass of deep red Cabernet splashed across the socialite's pristine ivory silk. The glass shattered on the floor like a gunshot. The orchestra faltered. The room went cold. The socialite stared at the red stain on her gown, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She looked up at the trembling elderly woman, her neck muscles straining with rage. "You stupid senile bitch," the socialite shrieked. The elderly woman raised her hands, her voice a terrified whisper. I am so sorry. I was just looking for my son. I got turned around." "Your son." The socialite stepped forward, her heels clicking like a predator's claws on the marble. "Who let a peasant like you into my home? This dress is a custom piece. It is worth more than your life." She raised her hand, her arm fully extended, fingers tensed for a blow that would have shattered the frail woman. Helen didn't think about the tuition. She didn't think about her future. She moved. Crack. The sound of the slap echoed through the grand hallway. But the old woman didn't fall. Helen stood center frame, her head snapped sideways by the force of the strike, her eyes shut tight as she absorbed the violence meant for the mother of the dragon. In the background, standing in the shadows of a classical painting, a sharply dressed Asian man finally looked up. His black suit jacket shifted, revealing the tail of a dragon tattoo across his sternum. He didn't move to help. He simply checked his watch. The countdown had begun. The air in the Choi Grand Ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating musk of extreme wealth. To the 500 guests swirling in silks and tailored wool, the night was a victory lap for the city's newest shipping merger. To Helen Cox, it was a test of physical and mental endurance. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her dark brown uniform a stark contrast to the ivory pillars and gold-leafed walls. Her tray, loaded with crystal flutes of vintage Krug, felt heavier with every passing hour. Each time she leaned in to offer a drink, she was met not with a face, but with a shoulder or a turn back. To these people, she was part of the architecture, necessary for their comfort, but invisible to their eyes. "Watch it, girl," a young man snapped, his voice sharp with unearned authority. He hadn't even looked at her as he backed into her path, nearly sending the $3,000 tray tumbling. Helen didn't flinch. She performed the practice dance of the invisible, pivoting on the balls of her feet despite the searing ache in her heels. "My apologies, sir," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic hum that went entirely unacknowledged. She retreated to the periphery of the room, her gaze momentarily drifting to the grand, sweeping staircase. In her mind's eye, the marble steps shifted into the concrete stairs of a university stage. She could almost see her younger sister, Maya, walking across it in a cap and gown, her smile bright enough to eclipse the grime of the city they'd grown up in. Maya was brilliant, a pre-med student who carried the dreams of their entire bloodline on her shoulders. But those dreams had a price, one measured in tuition statements and late rent notices. Helen gripped the edges of her tray. 6 more hours, she told herself. 6 more hours, and I've covered the lab fees. The microaggressions were a constant, rhythmic tide. A socialite wiped her fingers on a silk napkin and dropped it onto Helen's tray as she passed, treating her like a walking waste bin. A group of executives laughed loudly, one of them gesturing so wildly he nearly struck her face, never once pausing to see if he'd caused a disturbance. Through it all, Helen kept her posture rigid and her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She had learned long ago that for a woman like her, survival in these rooms meant absorbing the coldness without letting it freeze her heart. She felt the weight of her sister's future like a physical mantle, a shield against the casual cruelty of the elite. She wasn't just a maid, she was a bridge. Every condescending look she ignored was a stone laid for Maya's path. Across the room, the Choi daughter laughed, a shrill, predatory sound that cut through the soft orchestral music. Helen looked away, her eyes searching for a quiet corner to breathe, but instead, they landed on something else. Near the buffet, an elderly woman in a light blue lace dress was wandering aimlessly, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn purse. She looked like a bird trapped in a hurricane. Helen felt the first crack in her professional mask. The woman didn't belong here, not because she lacked the money, but because she lacked the malice. As the socialite in the ivory gown began to march toward the buffet, her face flushed with wine and irritation, Helen realized the two paths were about to collide. The invisible wall was about to break. The collision was sharp and sudden, the sound of fine silk snagging against a tray of hors d'oeuvres cutting through the ambient hum of the ballroom. A glass of deep red Cabernet, held loosely in the hand of the socialite in the ivory gown, tipped in slow motion. The wine didn't just spill, it bloomed across the pristine fabric of her dress like a fresh wound. The silence that followed was vacuum-sealed. The orchestra's violins trailed off into a discordant scratch, and the 500 guests turned as one, their eyes locking onto the center of the grand hallway. The socialite stared down at the ruined Vera Wong, her breath hitching in a jagged, rhythmic gasp. Her face, usually a mask of practiced porcelain beauty, curdled into a gargoyle snarl. Her eyes snapped up to the elderly woman in the light blue lace, who was trembling so violently the small leather purse in her hands rattled. "You clumsy, senile hag," the socialite shrieked. Her voice didn't just carry, it clawed at the walls. Kang Tae-jin took a staggering step back, her eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on terror. I am so sorry, miss. I didn't see you. I was looking for my son." "Your son?" The socialite stepped forward, her heels clicking like a predator's nails on the marble. "Who let a stray like you into my home? You smell like mothballs and the gutter. This dress is worth more than your entire miserable existence." She raised her hand. It was a calculated, theatrical movement, the arm fully extended, the body leaning forward with the weight of generations of entitlement. She wasn't just going to strike a woman. She was going to exert dominance over a creature she deemed subhuman. Helen Cox didn't think about the rent. She didn't think about Maya's tuition or the blacklisting that would surely follow. In that split second, she wasn't a maid. She was a shield. She stepped into the gap, her boots pivoting on the polished floor as she placed her body directly between the predator and the prey. The slap didn't sound like a hand hitting skin. It sounded like a gavel hitting a death sentence. The force of the blow was enough to snap Helen's head to the side. Her eyes shut tightly as the world spun, her vision momentarily exploding into white sparks. A searing, white-hot heat bloomed across her cheek, radiating from the point of impact down to her jaw. She didn't collapse. She didn't even cry out. She stood her ground, her fingers digging into the fabric of her beige apron as she absorbed the violence that would have shattered the frail woman behind her. A visible red mark, the crimson mark, began to spread across Helen's dark skin, the shape of the socialite's fingers branding her like a hot iron. The room remained deathly still, the air thick with the metallic tang of the shattered wine glass on the floor. "How dare you touch me?" the socialite whispered, her voice trembling with the realization that a servant had dared to intervene. "Security. Get this filth out of my sight." Helen kept her eyes down, her cheek throbbing in time with her heartbeat. Behind her, she felt the small, cold hands of Kang Tae-jin clutching her arm in a grip of pure desperation. In the shadows behind the pillars, the Asian man in the black suit finally moved. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his cufflink, the tail of the dragon tattoo on his chest flickering under the golden light of the wall sconce. He looked at Helen's bruised face, then at the socialite, and finally at his watch. The party was over. They just didn't know it yet. The silence following the slap was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a terrifying suspension of breath that made the heavy gold curtains of the ballroom feel like the walls of a tomb. The socialite was still panting, her chest heaving as she stared at the red handprint burning into Helen's cheek. She opened her mouth to deliver a final, crushing insult, but the words died in her throat. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from a foyer. Then, another. The massive mahogany doors of the ballroom, which had stood open all night to welcome the city's elite, were being slammed shut by men in charcoal suits who moved with the synchronization of a military unit. The heavy brass bolts slid home with a definitive, bone-chilling click. The music didn't just fade. The conductor's baton snapped in his hand as he caught sight of the figures lining the perimeter. The orchestra scrambled into a panicked stillness. Then he stepped out of the shadows. Kang Tae-jin did not rush. He walked with a predatory grace that made the sprawling marble floor seem small. His black suit jacket was open, the silk lining brushing against the dragon ink that climbed his sternum, a dark omen peeking through his white linen shirt. The guests, who moments ago were titans of industry, shrank back, creating a wide, hollow path. He didn't look at the billionaires. He didn't look at the security teams reaching for radios that were now dead. His eyes were fixed solely on the dark-skinned woman standing rigid in a brown uniform, and the trembling mother she was still shielding. The socialite, sensing the shift in the room's oxygen, but too arrogant to recognize the face of death, stepped forward. "Who are you?" "This is a private." Tae-jin didn't even turn his head. He raised a single hand, and the man beside him, a mountain of a person with a scarred brow, stepped forward and delivered a backhand so swift it sent the woman sprawling into the buffet table she had just been defending. The sound of crashing crystal and silver trays was the only scream allowed in the room. Tae-jin reached Helen. He stopped inches away, his presence radiating a cold, terrifying heat. For the first time in her life, Helen didn't feel invisible. She felt seen with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Slowly, Tae-jin reached out. His fingers were steady, his touch surprisingly light as he tilted Helen's chin upward. He traced the edge of the crimson mark on her cheek with the pad of his thumb. His eyes, usually unreadable as black glass, flared with a sudden, violent light. "You took this for her?" he asked. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried to every corner of the frozen room. Helen swallowed hard, her voice a mere whisper. "She's someone's mother. She didn't deserve it." Tae-jin's gaze shifted to Kang Tae-jin, who let out a sob of relief and buried her face in her son's chest. He wrapped one arm around his mother, but his eyes returned to Helen, pinning her in place. He checked his watch, the platinum face glinting under the chandeliers. 10 minutes, he announced to the room, his voice flat and final. In 10 minutes, the Choi family name will be a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. In 10 minutes, every guest who watched this happen and stayed silent will find their credit lines severed and their secrets on the front page. He looked back at the terrified hosts, his expression settling into a mask of absolute, icy resolve. The party is over. But for you, the nightmare is only just beginning. The transition from the chaos of the ballroom to the silence of the Kang estate felt like crossing into another dimension. Helen sat in the back of a midnight black armored sedan, her hand still instinctively hovering near her throbbing cheek. Beside her, Kang Tae-jin held her other hand with surprising strength, her thumb tracing soothing circles over Helen's knuckles. Outside the tinted windows, the city lights blurred into long ribbons of neon, but inside the car, there was only the scent of expensive leather and the heavy, unspoken weight of a life changed in 10 minutes. When the car finally hummed to a stop, it wasn't at a police station or a hospital, but before a sprawling fortress of glass and dark stone nestled in the hills. The gates slid open like the jaws of a silent giant. Helen was led through hallways that breathed a different kind of wealth than the choice. This was a quiet, dangerous luxury, where every shadow felt deliberate. In a room that looked more like a high-end medical suite than a bedroom, a private physician moved with clinical efficiency. Helen sat on the edge of a bed draped in silk sheets that felt like water against her skin. The doctor applied a cooling salve to the crimson mark on her face, the sting fading into a numb, tingling coolness. Throughout the process, she remained silent, her mind racing back to Maya and the tuition money she was sure was now gone. The swelling will subside by morning, the doctor murmured, stepping back as the door clicked open. Kang Tae-jin entered, having shed his suit jacket. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and in the soft, recessed lighting of the room, the dragon across his chest seemed to breathe. It wasn't just ink. It was a map of a life lived in the trenches of power. He dismissed the doctor with a slight tilt of his head and walked toward her. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his presence filling the room until the air felt tight. He didn't look like the monster the guests at the gala had seen. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a debt he hadn't expected to owe. "My mother is sleeping," he said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant frequency that vibrated in Helen's chest. "She hasn't stopped asking about the girl with the brave eyes. She thinks you are an angel. I told her angels don't bleed." Helen looked up at him, her pulse quickening. "I'm not an angel. I'm a maid who needed a paycheck. And now, I don't have one." Tae-jin stepped closer, reaching into his pocket to produce a small, heavy velvet box. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the nightstand with a definitive thud. "You took a blow meant for the only person I love. In my world, we don't pay in paychecks. We pay in blood and loyalty." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and for the first time, Helen saw the man behind the tattoo, a man who lived by a code that was as ancient as it was violent. "Your sister's tuition was paid in full 20 minutes ago. Her future is no longer your burden. It is mine." Helen's breath hitched. "Why?" "Because you shielded the dragon's mother," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying sincerity. "And now the dragon shields you." The following morning, the sun rose over Seoul, but for the Choi family, the light brought no warmth, only the cold, surgical precision of an execution. While Helen sat in the quiet library of the Kang estate, sipping tea that cost more than her previous monthly salary, the world outside was being systematically dismantled. Kang Tae-jin did not fight with fists or fire that morning. He fought with the terrifying, invisible hand of global finance. He sat in his glass-walled office, the dragon tattoo hidden beneath a bespoke charcoal suit, watching a bank of monitors that flickered with the frantic red of falling stocks. Beside him, a team of silent men in headsets worked with the grim focus of a bomb squad. Every time Tae-jin tapped his fingers on the mahogany desk, another pillar of the Choi empire crumbled. It started with their credit. By 9 a.m., the Choi Group's primary lenders received a series of risk assessments from anonymous sources. detailed ledgers of offshore tax evasion and laundered shipping manifests that Tae-jin had kept in his arsenal for years. By 9:30 a.m., their lines of credit were frozen. The Choi family's wealth, built on a foundation of perceived stability, began to evaporate like mist. "Interest on the debt," Tae-jin murmured, his voice as cold as the air conditioning. "They took a maid's dignity. I'll take their legacy." In their penthouse, the Choi family watched in horror as their personal accounts were flagged for federal investigation. The socialite who had delivered the slap screamed at her father as her black titanium cards were declined at a luxury boutique. She was escorted out of the store while influencers recorded her humiliation on their phones, a digital branding to match the red mark she had left on Helen's face. By noon, the shipping merger that was supposed to be the family's crowning achievement was dead. Their partners, sensing the rot, fled like rats from a sinking vessel. Tae-jin didn't just want them poor. He wanted them erased. He authorized the predatory acquisition of their ancestral estate, buying their debt for pennies on the dollar through a dozen shell companies. Every time a notification chimed on Tae-jin's phone, a warehouse seized, a vessel impounded, a board member resigning. He thought of the way Helen had stood unyielding in that ballroom. She had taken a blow that would have broken his mother, and for that, he would ensure the choice never stood tall again. He looked at a live feed of the Choi Group's headquarters, where employees were already being seen leaving with cardboard boxes. There was no joy in his expression, only the grim satisfaction of a man balancing a ledger. The debt of blood was a heavy one, and he was a meticulous accountant. As the sun hit its zenith, the Choi Empire was no longer a player in the city skyline. It was a carcass being picked clean by the dragon. Tae-jin stood, adjusted his cuffs, and prepared to return to the estate. The financial war was over, but the personal retribution had only just begun. He had promised Helen protection, but he was beginning to realize that protecting her wasn't enough. He wanted to give her the world he was currently tearing away from his enemies. The transformation of Helen Cox did not happen with a fanfare, but with the silent weight of silk and the sharp click of a deadbolt. In the weeks following the destruction of the Choi Empire, the dark brown uniform and beige apron were burned, replaced by a wardrobe that felt like liquid armor. Helen stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her private suite at the Kang estate, draped in a charcoal-colored sheath dress that fit her like a second skin. Around her neck sat a heavy platinum chain with a single pendant, a dragon coiled around a black diamond. It wasn't just jewelry. It was the dragon's mark. She walked down the grand hallway, no longer hugging the walls or lowering her gaze. For the first time, the men in charcoal suits didn't look through her. They snapped to attention, their heads bowing in a synchronized wave of respect as she passed. The air in the estate felt different now, heavy with the realization that the woman who had once been moving furniture was now the heartbeat of the dragon's inner circle. Her new role was officially titled Chief of Staff for Kang Tae-jin, but the title was a polite fiction. In reality, Helen had become the gatekeeper. She managed the elder woman's care, her social appointments, and the security detail that hovered like ghosts in the periphery. But more than that, she had become the only person, aside from Tae-jin himself, who held the power to speak in the dragon's ear. One afternoon, as Helen walked through the city's most exclusive shopping district with Kang Tae-jin on her arm, she saw the true extent of her new identity. A group of socialites, women who had stood in the Choi ballroom and laughed while Helen was struck, froze mid-sentence as she approached. Their faces, once masks of bored entitlement, drained of color. They didn't just step aside, they retreated into the doorways of boutiques, their eyes fixed on the floor. Helen didn't offer a sneer or a triumphant look. She simply kept walking, her head held high, the black diamond catching the sunlight. She realized then that she didn't need to say a word. The red mark on her cheek had faded into a faint, silver memory, but the story of how that mark had dismantled an empire had become the city's most terrifying ghost story. To the elite of Seoul, Helen was no longer a maid. She was the living embodiment of Kang Tae-jin's wrath. She was the one woman they could never touch, never insult, and never ignore. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged skyline, Tae-jin joined her on the balcony. He didn't speak at first, merely leaning against the railing. His white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon's tail coiled around his wrist. "The city is whispering your name," he said, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "They're afraid," Helen replied, looking out over the lights. "I can see it in their eyes. They look at me and see you." Tae-jin turned to her, his gaze intense and unyielding. "They should be afraid. But they don't just see me, Helen. They see the woman who was brave enough to stand when everyone else was kneeling. In this city, fear is just another word for respect. You've earned it." Helen touched the pendant at her throat. She had started this journey wanting only to be seen as human. Now, she was something far more formidable. She was the shadow and the shield, the woman who had crossed the invisible wall and found a kingdom waiting on the other side. The air in the neighborhood where Helen had grown up was thick with the scent of rain-slicked asphalt and cheap exhaust, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed halls of the Kang estate. Helen walked with a new grace, her silhouette sharp against the crumbling brickwork of the medical student housing. She was there to see Maya, to finally witness the peace she had bought with her own blood. For a brief moment, as she climbed the stairs, the weight of the dragon's mark around her neck felt lighter, replaced by the simple, ancient joy of a sister's embrace. But desperation has a scent of its own, sour and metallic. As Helen exited the building an hour later, the street felt wrong. The usual rhythmic chaos of the city had stalled into an eerie, manufactured silence. A rusted van, its engine idling with a jagged rattle, sat slumped against the curb. Helen stopped, her hand flying instinctively to the black diamond at her throat. She wasn't the invisible Maid anymore. She was a target, and she realized too late that she had stepped out from behind the dragon's shield. A man stepped from the shadows of a recessed doorway. It was Richard Sterling. The man who had once stood bored while Helen was slapped now looked like a ghost of himself. His designer suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot and twitching with the erratic energy of a cornered rat. Behind him, three men with the heavy, scarred features of the Moretti dockworkers emerged, their hands tucked significantly into the waistbands of their jeans. "You," Richard spat, his voice cracking. "You destroyed us. My father is in a cell, our accounts are empty, and Beatrice, she's a joke. All because of a common servant." Helen didn't flinch. She stood her ground, the same rigid posture she had held in the Choi ballroom. "You destroyed yourselves, Richard. I was just the mirror that showed you who you were." "Shut up," he shrieked, his face contorting into a mask of pathetic rage. He took a staggering step forward, gesturing to the thugs. "The dragon thinks he's won. He thinks he can just take everything. But he forgot that even a dragon has a soft underbelly. He'll give it all back. The ships, the holdings, the dignity, once he realizes we have his favorite little pet." Helen turned to run, but the men moved with the practiced efficiency of street predators. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth, the smell of grease and stale tobacco overwhelming her senses. She fought, her heels scraping against the pavement, her mind screaming for Maya to stay inside, to stay safe. As they shoved her into the dark, sweltering interior of the van, the pendant at her neck was ripped free, the platinum chain snapping with a sharp, final metallic ping. It fell to the gutter, a lone spark of luxury in the filth. Richard peered into the van, a manic, trembling smile stretching across his lips. "Call him," Richard whispered to one of the men. "Tell the dragon his debt just doubled." The van doors slammed shut, plunging Helen into a terrifying darkness. She was no longer the most feared woman in the city. She was a prisoner of the desperate. But as the van sped away, she didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, crystalline certainty. Richard Sterling thought he was saving his empire, but he had just committed the one sin for which there was no mercy. He hadn't just stolen a woman. He had stolen the dragon's heart, and the fire that was coming would leave nothing but ash. The silence in the Kang estate had become a living, breathing thing, a heavy, suffocating pressure that heralded the coming storm. When the phone rang, the sound didn't just vibrate. It shattered the stillness like a gunshot. Kang Tae-jin didn't wait for the ransom demands. He didn't listen to Richard Sterling's frantic, stuttering voice on the other end. He only needed one thing: the GPS coordinates pinging from the black diamond pendant that had been crushed into the asphalt near Maya's apartment. 10 minutes, Tae-jin whispered, his voice a jagged edge of ice. Give me 10 minutes in that hellhole, and bring the kerosene. The warehouse at the edge of the docks was a skeletal ruin of rusted iron and rotting wood. Inside, Richard Sterling paced a circle of dim, yellow light, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. Helen sat bound to a wooden chair in the center of the room, her silhouette sharp against the peeling shadows. She didn't look like a victim. Even with her wrists chafed by coarse hemp rope, she watched Richard with a terrifying, pitying calm. He's coming, Richard, she said softly. And he isn't coming to negotiate. Shut up. Richard screamed, spinning toward her. He raised his hand, the same arrogant reflex he had inherited from a choice, intending to silence her with a blow. The warehouse walls didn't just shake, they disintegrated. A black armored SUV tore through the corrugated metal doors, the screech of rending steel drowning out Richard's cry. Before the dust could settle, the dragon emerged from a wreckage. Tae-jin didn't look like a businessman or a scion of wealth anymore. He looked like the devil incarnate, his white shirt stained with oil and his eyes glowing with a predatory, lethal light. The three Moretti thugs barely had time to reach for their waistbands. Tae-jin moved like a phantom through the haze of smoke and debris. He didn't fire blindly. Every movement was a surgical strike of absolute violence. A muffled crack, a choked gasp, and the first man fell, his windpipe crushed by a single, precise strike. The second was sent through a rotted wooden crate, his ribs snapping like dry kindling under the weight of Tae-jin's boot. Richard scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, his bladder failing him as he hit the damp concrete. It's just business. Tae-jin, please. We can fix the accounts. Tae-jin didn't even acknowledge him. He walked straight to Helen, his gaze scanning her face for a fresh mark. When he saw the faint bruising on her wrists, a low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest. He pulled a serrated blade from his belt and sliced through her bindings in one fluid motion. Did he touch you? Tae-jin asked, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. No, Helen whispered, her voice steady as she stood, leaning into his strength. He was too afraid. Tae-jin turned his head slightly toward his second-in-command, who stood in the gaping hole of the doorway. Richard Sterling wants to talk about business, Tae-jin said, his eyes never leaving the weeping man in the corner. Take him to the basement of the docks. Show him what happens to a rat when the dragon stops playing. As the men dragged Richard screaming into the night, Tae-jin wrapped his jacket around Helen's shoulders. The warehouse behind them began to burn, the orange flames licking the sky as the dragon reclaimed what was his. The 10 minutes were up. The debt was settled in fire. 6 months had passed since the fires at the docks had settled into ash, and the name Choi had been scrubbed from the city's ledgers as if it were a stain on a window pane. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant, rhythmic hum of a soul that continued to move beneath the shadow of the dragon. Helen stood on the wide, white stone terrace of the Kang estate, the silk of her emerald gown snapping softly in the breeze. She no longer checked her watch for the end of the shift. She no longer counted the seconds until she could take off her shoes. Her posture was still rigid, but it was no longer the defensive stance of a woman expecting a blow. It was the poise of a woman who knew that the ground beneath her feet was finally her own. Beside her, Jang Tae-jin sat in a high-back chair, a thick wool blanket draped over her knees. The elderly woman looked stronger now, her eyes clear and focused, as she watched the sunset paint the Han River in shades of bruised purple and gold. She reached out, her hand no longer trembling, and squeezed Helen's fingers. The city looks so small from up here, the mother whispered, her voice a gentle anchor in the evening quiet. It's hard to believe so much noise comes from such a tiny place. Helen smiled, the silver scar on her cheek catching the light. It was barely visible now, a faint map of where she had been, but it remained the most precious mark she owned. It's quiet because you're safe, Mother. That's the only part of the city that matters to me. Below the terrace, in the courtyard, Maya was laughing. Helen watched her sister, now a confident student whose only worry was an upcoming anatomy exam, walking with a group of friends toward the gate. Maya didn't have to look over her shoulder. She didn't have to wonder if the rent would be paid. She was free to be brilliant, and that was the greatest victory of all. The heavy glass doors behind them slid open with a whisper of precision. Kang Tae-jin stepped onto the terrace, his silhouette broad and imposing against the light of the interior. He had traded his tactical gear for a simple black sweater, his sleeves pushed back to reveal the dragon tattoo that had once terrified Helen, but now felt like a promise. He didn't speak as he approached. He simply stood behind Helen, his presence a solid, warm weight at her back. He looked out at the sprawling metropolis he controlled, then turned his gaze to the woman standing beside his mother. The invisible wall was gone, replaced by a legacy built on a single moment of unyielding courage. "They're calling the new hospital wing the Cox Pavilion," Tae-jin said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "A place for the people the city usually ignores." "My mother's idea, but your name?" Helen leaned back against him, looking out at the glittering lights of the city she had once served. She was no longer a maid, no longer a victim, and no longer just a shadow in the halls of the great. She was the heart of the dragon's house, the woman who had turned a slap into a revolution. As the first stars began to pierce the dark velvet of the sky, Helen realized that the story didn't end with revenge. It ended with peace. She was safe, she was loved, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. If you felt the power of that final transformation, don't let the story end here. From a humble maid to the heart of a powerful empire, Helen's journey proves that one act of courage can change your world forever. If you enjoyed seeing justice served and loyalty rewarded, we'd love to have you with us for the next one. Here is how you can support the channel. Like this video if you were rooting for Helen from the very first slap. Comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment of the dragon's revenge? We read every single one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of high-stakes justice and unbelievable transformations. Thank you for watching until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.